Hey Collective, it's Al. I'm coming to you with a video that will be accompanying a really important post I'm releasing on LinkedIn this afternoon that's basically a direct response to what I'm observing of a mental health crisis spreading across our collective's consciousness that I wanted to speak to in a way that helped illuminate some of the things that I've incurred in life that may help the children of our planet kind of get through the hurdles that will come their way as they do the pilgrimage to find themselves and make themselves whole again. But as we begin, I just wanted to state that I do understand the subject matter dealing with childhood trauma and how it affects every decision that you make sometimes in the rest of the course of your life is kind of a sensitive subject. So I will tread lightly across it while still keeping the meat and potatoes to the situation candidly, so as to really help people who are in struggle trying to face their shadow overcome the darkness that comes with the process of finding the light within. But as we begin, understand a couple things. First and foremost is understand that as we take this journey of my own personal life, you're going to see how a particular childhood trauma affected everything about my personality and who I became, and how it fractured the mirror of how I saw myself, and the ramifications that led throughout my life, and all of the choices I then made. And in that, I'm hoping that you will see glimpses of your own struggles or things that you must overcome in life, understanding that there is a resolution to it on the path to redemption of yourself. But understanding that it is time sensitive, meaning that because I was so young when it began, some of what I'm going to say may no longer be true for me now as an adult, because I have healed the wounds that traumatized me. But it is a long process and there are no shortcuts. So if anything, I'm hoping and praying that it gives you the ignition to do the work required of you to put yourself back together, and to understand that with time and age and spiritual study, you evolve to a place where you can then unpack the demon that lay within to such a degree that you understand how the splinters in your timeline began to form and how it affected the trajectory of your life. So that's first and foremost. Second, you're going to hear possible noises around me, specifically horns blaring, because there's like reconstruction all around me all the time lately. And there's a construction site where one of the things that moves blows horns consistently throughout the day. So if you hear it, just kind of disregard it and pay attention more to what I'm saying than maybe sound or music coming from neighbors or whatnot. So first and foremost, what I wanted to say with this is that everyone's journey is super specific to who they are, and that most souls have their own course load within the Great Earth Academy, and some of it is not fair. And I will never justify the ends to the means sometimes, but I will speak to how I healed myself in the long run by looking at the kernel that began the fractured mirror that I would become. So let's start with the basics. I am a half, right? My dad is, I believe, German, and my mother is Spanish. And so coming from that environment with no father, what is about to happen to me will be imperative for you to understand as a foundational level that I was born into a very Catholic family. And specifically a Marroquin, which actually, if you want to follow up, I have an ancestor who was the first Archbishop of Guatemala. And as such, Catholicism was super imperative to my childhood and to my early years. And part of what's about to happen is going to be very illuminating as a trajectory for my life. So as such, one of the things that happened within my family is that my grandmother, through some unfortunate events, ended up in an orphanage when she was very young. And as such, it was a Catholic orphanage in Guatemala, and she was very white, reddish hair with beautiful light eyes. I believe they were green. And as such, you can only imagine what she went through looking that way in a Central American country. Our family descendants are from Spain, and so she looked a little odd from what I understood, but she was devoutly Christian. I mean, so Catholic, it was incredible. And yet my mother, my direct mother, was not only super spiritual and faithful to God, but had a severe adverse reaction to organized religion because of what she deemed to be hypocrisy and the rumors that had begun in the early 80s of discrepancies towards children, that we're going to just say that way, and that she didn't trust them with me. But I didn't know that going into what's about to happen. So, but because my grandmother was so Catholic, she would go to church every Sunday morning for Latin Mass and would insistently ask me if I wanted to go. And my mother hadn't always left it up to me because of what I just said. So from the get-go, I was already set up to have a very interesting life path. And what ended up happening to me then just exacerbated the situation. But when I was about 5 or 6, I started to really, really love how devoted my grandmother was to God. And so I began going to Latin Mass with her in New Orleans, where I'm from, and went for quite a while before finally being put into catechism, where I began to have questions that I was getting in trouble for asking at a very tender age. The reason I'm saying this is because at the same time that this was going on, we had a neighbor move in, a couple. And when they first moved in, it was just the two of them, and everything was hunky-dory. But as I was going through catechism and stuff like that, I began to get in severe trouble with the priests and with the nuns because I would ask questions of them that did not make sense to me at such a young age, relating to Adam and Eve and how that worked and was there incest and stuff like that. So I got in trouble quickly. About 3 months after that, one of the siblings of one of the couple that moved in next to me moved in into the third, room in their house. And unbeknownst to me, he preyed upon children. And his M.O., and this is the sensitive part, so I promise to go gently here, was, do you guys remember the picture of the big JC of Jesus, where he had the long hair and stuff, he has the V-neck, which has the heart on it right here? Well, guess what he emulated in order to gain the trust of young boys like me? So, flash forward, something happens, something unforgivable. And in that moment, because of what he looked like, and because of what I was going through in catechism, I believed that I had been punished directly for questioning God. And I was only 7 by this point. So it had only been like a year or two since I'd been going. And then I got kicked out and stuff because once that happened, I felt violated. My young, tender mind of an almost 8-year-old could not compartmentalize what had happened to me. And it began to splinter my personality to such a degree that everything that followed after that was rooted in my confusion as to the violation. So I ended up not going to church anymore, and I basically banished Jesus from my life because I felt like at that age, I had been assailed by him because the guy used that as a means to gain the trust of children. But because of the things that happened in that situation, a lot of dominoes began to fall within my life, and I went completely introverted along my journey. Understanding now, obviously, it had nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with faith. But remember, I'm only 7.5, 8 at this point. So one of the things that he used to lure me was friendship bracelets. And it took me a very long time to understand how important that would play into my development of close-knit relationships in my life. Because I was already at odds with what I perceived to be an assault from a deity at such a young age. I mistakenly took him to be the same, even to the point where I had a dream when that was happening. I think it was 3 weeks later, and my grandmother and my mother couldn't look at me without feeling heartbreak, and I could feel the burden of that struggle. And I was the only male heir. There were no other guys until I think my cousin had a boy, but outside of that, I was the only one for a long time. And I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to anchor myself inwards and to not make them suffer or do anything to hurt them any longer, because they already couldn't relate to me. I completely changed. I was an outgoing child. And what I didn't realize is I was processing the fact that it was because of how I looked and who I was that I was chosen to be the victim to this assailant. And it set another series of dominoes that would progress throughout my life of trust and distrust. But I felt violated by the attention I was getting, and I imploded inwards. And I wouldn't let my mother touch me, I wouldn't let my grandmother touch me, and I wouldn't let anyone near me for about 2 to 3 years. And I began this process of going so into my shadow and retracting so inwards that I began to observe the world around me very differently. And sadly, at the same time, I experienced the first stems of racism towards me because of the fact that they were beginning to tell that I was not white, because I obviously passed when I was a kid. But as I got older, I developed into my features, and I remember having situations suddenly occur within the same, I think it was 4 months, within the same period, where people would side with the Anglo-Saxon person over me and lie about me as a child. An adult lied on me to my mother, where I got a whooping, and then spread the rumor of the lie to other people who were the parents of my closest friends, who then I became ostracized from. And as the implosion began to grow and grow inwards, the darkness took my soul. And a vision came to me where Jesus himself came to console me. But because I was so violated by the physicality of the false representative of that, I banished him from my life at 8 years old. And it was set a course with me in the church that is, an ongoing love-hate battle, right? Because I love God, I love the Bible, but I do not agree with certain things. So that was rooted at 8 years old. And as I imploded, I no longer trusted my mother, because in my mind at that age, she had left me to slaughter. And for some reason, it triggered something that was a false narrative that would come to pass, which was, I remember in Bible study growing up, that there was passages about that they would go after the firstborn sons of all these families in order to do X, Y, Z. And though I could not at the time place what exactly I was tapping into, that also set off another series of dominoes that would affect my life eternally, right? Because I felt personally persecuted, not just by God at the time, because I had questioned the logistics of some of the things that were written, but also because of the fragmentations that started to grow from my own struggles with having been a child that was outwardly very outgoing, and people really liked me, and I got a lot of attention. And that attention cost me my virtue and my innocence. And it set me in a blaze in a way that was very detrimental to my true core. So I shut down for 2 years. And I wouldn't let anybody near me, and instead I stopped and observed everyone and everything around me, looking for betrayers, which would set another series of events in my life that would come to pass as that I would age. And so in that period of those 2 years, I couldn't tell you what was going on at school. I couldn't tell you what was going on with anybody. I detached from everybody, and I became just the observer, not a participant. And I would not engage adults because I felt like any one of the adults would violate me. And so at such a young age, I became an adult overnight, and I didn't know what to do with the weight of the pain. I couldn't turn to God because of what I had said at my young mind, not understanding that there was a difference there. I couldn't rationalize it as a young boy. And I didn't feel like I could talk to my mother or my grandmother. But instead of feeling victimized by the intimacy aspect of it that most children go through, I went the other way, where I was going to gain the upper hand. And I was not ashamed of that, but instead I was betrayed by it. And there was an anger that settled into my heart, and it began to harden. So as the 2 years went by, I was so disassociated from reality and only observing that I barely talked, and it really freaked my mom out. And she could tell that it was in response to me responding to her, which made her feel guilty. And a big strain between my mother and I began to form. And even more so between my grandmother and me. Because I was so young, how could she still go to church? Where you know what I mean? Like, how could she do that to me? How could she side with religion over me when she knew what I had gone through? Never communicating to her that I rationalized the assailant as they didn't know that I understood clearly that the way he gained my trust was by emulating Jesus Christ. Like, it was so horrific that I never articulated it though. And so my grandmother and I we were like this at first, and then I just didn't want anything to do with my grandmother. I felt betrayed even more by her because she was choosing the church over me, which would play out again later in life in a different dynamic. So as this began to go, and the reason I'm telling you all this is because of how the splinters began to affect me in every possible decision I made going forward, especially through adolescence. You see, I learned that friendship is questionable, and that because I was lured by friendship bracelets, that friendship was a questionable thing and that I should not trust anybody. And making things worse was the fact that I was now ostracized and alienated from my faith because I had been robbed of it overnight. And as that began to kind of formulate, I began to disassociate from everyone that I knew beforehand because I felt like anybody would betray me. And I might repeat myself, but you understand as we go forward how it develops into a psychology that is not beneficial for those of us who have been traumatized as children. And it's important that you know layer by layer, as candidly as I can, so that you understand how different the child that was became the man you see now. But it's a journey, and it took a while. So, unfortunately, a byproduct of an assault like that at such a young age, personally speaking, began to awaken urges within me earlier than other people. And I felt like that was a violation against myself, because again, my being attractive had wounded me. The reason I was targeted in my mind was because I was so looked at. I mean, everywhere I went before it happened, I was one of those things. I was a mixed race kid in New Orleans in the early 80s. Y'all, I looked weird, right? In a good way. But it had betrayed me. And there was a theme growing here of betrayal that because I indoctrinated into myself as a character definition would play out over and over and over again throughout my life. And the struggle with faith was eternal. It was a fire that was not going to be quenched. God was not going to let me go, but I would pay the cost to the early onset of what I believed had happened to me. So we get to the point where I'm I'd say about 10. And I flunked the 5th grade, which I had never had academic problems. I was a smart kid. And my mother, who already was ostracized from me because I kept her so far away from me, because I felt like every time I touched her or was near her, there was drama. There was I was the violated child that ruined her life, was the way that I internalized it at 8, 9, 10 years old. And I was so introverted at that point that I didn't speak to anybody really that much, and I only had maybe 1 or 2 people I would speak to regularly. And so I became victimized. I hit a victimized stand in my life that I had never known before. And I didn't know how to make reality make sense to me that someone could do that to someone as young as I was. So when I flunked the first time, it blew up into a big argument with my mother. And a lot of bad things happened to me again at that age where I started to get bullied and stuff like that. But unbeknownst to them, because of what had happened to me, I didn't stay victimized. Instead, I became the aggressor. And anyone who spoke to me in a disrespectful way or even tried to lay a hand on me would catch my hands. And I was ruthless. I was like, if one of us is going down, it's not going to fucking be me. And I got very, very aggressive about being very, very protective of people who I felt were victimized in any way. But I was an asshole. And I did not care. If we were going to throw down, you were going to the morgue and I was going to live. Again, rooted in the violation of what had happened to me. And so as I developed over time, now I was awakening as you do in adolescence, but at 11. And I was aware that I was gay. And now imagine knowing that you're gay and that the first person who even was interested in you violated you at 8 years old, who was also the same sex, and understand the struggle and the turmoil that I free fell into when trying to rationalize what else was going to happen to me. And I just began to cycle through this thing of never trusting anyone. And yet the person that I was meant to love was going to be male, but I could not at 9, 10 years old, or 10 by this point, I couldn't understand where this was going, and I understand what I had done to God. Why has all of this happened to me? And I wasn't talking to anybody, and there wasn't really, in the 80s, you didn't really talk about it, guys. I hate to tell you. But this mental health crisis that we're having may have always been there. We just never spoke about it because we were conditioned to keep it in. And it fragmented to such a degree that I couldn't even look at myself. And what made it worse is not only was I awakening intimately, and I was realizing aspects of myself that I felt were in stark contradiction not only to my faith that had been weaponized against me because of being gay. I knew I was going to hell for that. Then I'd been violated by somebody who was emulating a picture of Jesus Christ, who also, did unspeakable things to me. And all of this thing was spiraling, and my grandmother chose faith over me, I thought, and my mother felt like I had done, it was just like a shit show, guys. It was bad. But the appearance had not changed. And I began, as adolescence hit and everything began to develop, go back to getting more attention, which really put me on guard. And this is pivotal to those of you who are trying to understand how trauma as a child can affect even the positive aspects of your life. I was cute, really cute. I mean, I didn't think so then because, again, I was damaged goods, but I can look back at the picture and go, oh, I see why I was getting all that attention. But remember, my psychology at 8 was because I was cute that I was assaulted. And so I became vicious in how I approached people who were looking at me or whatever. I was like, what the hell, why are you looking at me? So though it was being a blessing, I thought it a curse. And it developed another layer to my psychology where I never trusted anyone. And so I would come across to other people as sometimes being arrogant, maybe. But instead, I was cautious. I'm one of the type of people, even to this day, even though I've healed those wounds, I still observe someone before I make a decision as to whether I'm going to engage with them. It's in my DNA at this point. But at the time, I was so defensive about it that even the positive responses from other people made me feel victimized because I could not escape the truth that I was attacked because of this. So as I began to develop, I began to be what we call kind of the mean boy. I was never a bully, by the way, because I knew what the pain was to be the victim of such things. I never was assailant, but I would protect people who were being victimized. But if you came at me the wrong way, I would be the first one to smack you. Like I said, when I was going down, it was going to be you over me. And I was gay. And they were aware at a very early age that I was showing signs of being gay. And because of the personal crisis I was going through, believing that if I was gay, that I would be participating in the violation of what happened. Oh my God, it was a whole psychology fuck show. But what ended up happening is my mother decided to move out of New Orleans because a particular governor ran for office who was once part of the Ku Klux Klan, if you can believe it. And she was like, oh, that's my cue, we gotta go. And the economy was in the toilet, it was I think 90 by then. And so we were heading into the recession. And so in order to kind of get us out of it, because she had been working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, because my grandmother had moved out because of the volatile relationship I had with her. So again, I cost my mom an ally that helped her feed the family, and so she was now working 2 jobs. And so I felt guilty for that as well. Not having healed any of myself, just layers upon layers, just adding shit on top of shit, just over and over and over again. So I agreed to move to Los Angeles and leave all of the friends I finally had formed. I finally allowed myself a best friend, and I finally allowed a close-knit group of people that I believed weren't trying to hurt me. And she asked me to move. And I had to leave them behind to move from a suburb, predominantly white suburb, of New Orleans to Los Angeles at the age of 13. Okay. Understand where I'm coming from in the psychology so far, and understand the shock value that came with all the struggle I was already going through, then being put into a Los Angeles school in South Central Los Angeles. And understand the target that was immediately put on my head for looking whiter, not being Mexican. It was, I'm not going to say the name of school, but it was off of Imperial Highway and Western. I'm talking about the hood, coming from where I came from. They had no academic classes for advanced students, and they were just starting algebra when I was already done with algebra, and I was supposed to be going into, I believe it's geometry. I can't remember what the 8th grade class was that would have been in New Orleans, but it did not exist in LA. They were just starting algebra, which I barely passed as it went, because By this point, psychologically, anything that someone was telling me I had to do without explaining it to me, where I had to follow rigid order to do something, was not going to work for me. So I barely passed algebra 1 and 2 by the time I was moving, and now I had to revert backwards and do it again, which led me to drop out of school at the age of, I believe it was 14. I was about to go into high school. And because of the high school in question, there was no way in hell that I was going to go. Because I had already been in fistfights, I had been jumped, like it was a lot. There was a lot of violence that happened to me at a very young age. So when I dropped out of school, I began lying to my mother so that she didn't know. And I'm telling you all of this so you guys can see how normal I am as a human being and how fucked up the choices I made that all stem from different idiosyncrasies and fragmentation of the mirror that would make me see the world differently than what it actually was. And instead of asking my mother to move me to another school, I just gave up on school altogether because I felt like I was reverting backwards and because of where I'd come from. And the sheer amount of trauma and drama and bullshit I had to overcome, I wasn't about to go backwards again ever in my life, which meant I couldn't heal. So simultaneously, not only did I drop out of school, but I began engaging in adult activities as a means to keep myself entertained. And it culminated into a situation where I had lied about my age to someone and, things happened. And I ended up being in a situation where trauma reoccurred to the body, and I forevermore was changed and not being able to ever consciously allow myself love. It was strike two. And in that moment, I was physically hurt. And I would not let that happen to me again. So I began to lose all sight of love as even a possibility for my life, and began to manipulate people in order to gain whatever I needed, having learned it from watching people do it to everyone else. And so I would then manipulate men into whatever I wanted them to do, and in that, permanently severing any type of close-knit relationship with another guy for 30 years. And it developed into a psychology where I thought I was getting the upper hand. But remember, I was only 14. So in reality, now looking back, I re-victimized myself, believing that I was the perpetrator when I should have been realizing that they knew I was underage and still did it anyway, and that I was now participating in a cycle. Which is ironic because even when I was a young person, I would never have dated anybody my own age. I just thought that was ridiculous. I only would ever date adults. But I didn't realize the toxic relationship I had with sex at that point, and I wasn't connecting the dots until later in life. And so, because I never dated anybody young, I was dated older, it never occurred to me that I was being re-victimized again, because I thought I was playing them, never realizing I was being played. So this went on for a little bit in free fall, and I stumbled upon a particular organization that I'm not going to say what it is, because heaven forbid, I don't deal with cults. But I ended up in a particular organization that is associated with a cult-like status, and it absolutely destroyed what was left of me. I ended up believing that I was joining a bigger cause, because remember, I was so heavily faithful. In spite of my angst against the organized religion, I still had my grandmother's imbued in me, and the fact that, Francisco Martin was the Archbishop of Guatemala, I knew God. But I did not know the face of God in the organized religion, because by this point, there were a lot of accusations that had been turned out to be true of the same assailant type in the houses of worship that I forbid myself from going, but I needed to find an outlet for my faith. And so I ended up crossing paths with probably the worst possible solution to this scenario, and joined it believing that it would be my answer, because I really believed I was here for a higher calling, and there's no way at such a young age that all of this happened for no reason, and I was desperately trying to find God again, which, by the way, he never left my side. But at that age, I'm only 14, this is what I'm going through, understanding where I've come from. I ended up participating in this organization, and it basically required me to work from 9 a.m. till 10:30 at night every day. And I did this for about a year and a half, where I would get yelled at and belittled and just completely destroyed, I'd say about every other day, because I just couldn't get up. I had dropped out of school so that I didn't have to go to school. And here I am now having to study all this stuff that I didn't want to study. And then it just became workload. And I just became slave labor. And I was only 15 by this point. And I was working 13, 14 hours a day, sometimes overnight, not going to school except maybe once a day. And they had promised I would be able to study what I wanted to study, but we would only go for like half a day, if lucky, and most of the time not even that. And it was a horrible situation. And I remember the day that I finally had enough, where I had been reamed and was crying and sobbing because this guy was like so mad at me for never being able to get up on time, even though I was only 15 years old. And that I couldn't, because they didn't understand how I couldn't work from 9 a.m. like everybody. Well, I had to be at a particular thing at 8. I would be on staff at 9, and then from 9 o'clock till 10:30 at night, I would be working, and then I was supposed to go straight to bed, having not seen any of my friends that I had made in this place, and I would just be supposed to go straight to bed, and I would have to be back up at 6 a.m. every day at 15 years old. Absolutely not. So it didn't work. And my soul and my personality were fighting to get my attention to get out of this situation. But by this point, my mother was now involved, and she had remarried a wonderful man who was also part of this. So if I left, I ran the high risk that all my friends had suffered if they left, which is they were no longer allowed to be part of the same family, and they were on their own. And so I once again had to choose myself. And I was terrified I was going to be a homeless teenager like the kids in Hollywood that surrounded me. Okay, so I left it, and thank God for the man who would become my stepfather, who I love and adore to this day. He took me in, and he also took in the other children of the people who did not leave, but instead just let their kids go. And basically they were emancipated and on the streets. And so we took them in. Now, during this time, we were hanging out in Hollywood, and so drugs became a thing. And I had a particular thing for up and set it down, and so that whole part of the journey began right at 16. And because I was engaging with adults for intimate purposes, I was also engaging with them with that. And so you begin to see the picture of dependency that is now forming with the ups that would lead me through most of my 20s. Okay. All masking the pain of something that I was deeply embedded in. Not to mention, once again, feeling betrayed by every adult in the world who let me suffer the consequence of this particular organization, and that I was not being spoken of. It was just a shit show. And I couldn't talk about it to my parents because they were still part of it. And though I love this man to death, I couldn't say anything. I would have been kicked out, and so would all of my friends. So now there's like 4 people living with us whose parents chose the faith over them, and now we're trying to raise it, and I'm having all these psychological issues. I'm, engaged in drugs and sex at this point, and I'm just trying to stay afloat. I'm like drowning. I'm drowning, and I'm trying to keep other people afloat, and I can't even keep myself afloat. And because my parents were also working and all this stuff, they were completely unaware of the things that were happening, and it just spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. All because of the fragmentation that started at such a young age from trauma. And I just kept repeating the process. Finally, I began to go back to school, and I began to build a small life for myself, remembering, though, that I had never graduated high school. And so I got my technical degree, never realizing that it wasn't, that I wasn't supposed to have gotten it because I never graduated high school. So I had to go back. Once getting a prominent job opportunity, I had gotten finally after building myself up, this really great hospital wanted me to come work with them, but they discovered that I didn't have a high school diploma, and so my past caught up with me yet again. And I lost the job opportunity and my face in that position, and so I left a technical degree in pharmacology, and I decided I would go back to regular school, embarrassed and again mortified by my choices and stuff. So now we're kind of trying to rebuild, and my stepdad, to his credit, is like, well, why don't you go back to college? If you go to college, I'll get you an apartment, and you can live on your own and build your life back up. And he was super supportive, right? In spite of the odds that I had with him about, again, someone in my family choosing their faith over me, a repetitive cycle that would keep going, I was grateful to him for having done that for me. And so I did. Of course, being on my own with that much trauma and so much fragmentation and betrayal, feeling like I'm betraying myself and all this stuff, I became alcohol dependent. And so realizing that alcohol wasn't my thing, and still to this day isn't. I can still have a cocktail or a couple cocktails and get drunk and go home, and that's it. There's no bender. I don't keep it at my house because I realize now as an adult that it's a downer, and I don't do downers. I don't do any of the stuff that makes you feel like sedated. I'm the opposite. So luckily for me, that was short-lived. But what I didn't come to know was that my mother would die, and I was only 26 years old. And we had only resolved what we could, but there were still things that I could not share with her because I didn't know how to articulate the pain that I couldn't see. I had masked it and I had fragmented it to such a degree that she saw me so brilliantly, and all I saw was dulling my light. My entire life at that point was to try to not stick out, not stick out, not stick out, because heaven knows what would happen to me. I got jumped, I got assaulted again intimately. Things were happening to me that I couldn't tell her because I was already a big failure in her, I thought, in her eyes. And yet she was trying to love me unconditionally, and I just wouldn't let her because of everything that had happened at such a young age. So upon the day she died, I knew that would be the last time I saw my stepfather. And we had promised her that we would stay together, and on her deathbed, I told her it was okay for her to go, that we'd be okay. And I knew in the moment I was lying to her, and when she passed, I held her hand. I knew he would be gone. He chose to face again over me, and I ended up completely alone, having to take care of myself for the first time in my life, full on, with all consequences. And a year after my mother's death, I got a DUI after someone having slipped something into my drink, and I get into a car that almost killed me. That was the beginning of the awakening for me. It had gotten to such a degree that I was willing to not be around anymore, and I was putting myself increasingly in more dangerous situations in order to escape the pain of now having lost the only family I had left. My grandmother had already died by this point, and the only aunt I have lived in New Orleans, and I was in California all by myself. So now the trauma is full on unleashed, and I am engulfed by the shadow in a way that I wish I could tell you was a redeeming story, but it was not. And I engaged in every possible thing you can do wrong in the world, and I was so pissed at everyone, especially God, especially the universe. I could not get from underneath the shadow. It had engulfed my soul. And it got to a point where I had to move back to New Orleans to be closer to my family, because I felt so isolated. If I didn't do it, I knew I was not going to survive. But when I went back, it was just a horrendous situation. Just completely different dynamics, different personality types, all from different traumas, it just wasn't working. And so I ended up living on my own and becoming dependent on a particular type of drug that I would do for 7 years daily and go to work and function as a high-functioning addict, massively engaging in sex. Until one day I find out from a friend of mine that someone who had an STD had personally assaulted me while I was asleep with the intention of giving me what they had because of my arrogance. Okay. So right around the same time, I'm walking home from the bar that I was working at. Remember, alcohol wasn't really my thing, it was something else. So I'm walking home from the bar that I worked at, and I'm a block away from my house, and there are two men waiting for me who assaulted me again. Only this time, they put something to the back of my head and pulled the trigger. And I could not tell you to this day where I went, but I can tell you that time did skip a beat. Because though I was in the gutter facing down where they wanted me and they pulled the trigger, I felt like I had been gone for like a second, but when I looked up, they were already passing me in their car. And so I have no idea what happened. Outside of the spiritual part that I will share in another story later, with the journey that brought me to the understanding of all the levels to how I came to be who I was at that time. So I went home and I had snapped. I was ready to go. And for the first time in my life, I heard a very clear, distinct voice that I knew, like internally, like to my soul recognition. And I realized it was me, the highest part of myself speaking to me. And it gave me a challenge. I can either give up or I can do something about it. And so at 36, 37, I began the process of finding what had gone wrong, and I stopped passing responsibility to anyone else but myself. And it took me a very long time to identify all the fragments of where everything kind of came from. I knew it was stemming from that childhood trauma, but I didn't know how influential it had become to my unconscious mind, who had now begun serving me by my bad behavior as a means to show me what I needed to look like. And so I began to open the box, or as I would say, the Russian doll, and I began to look at each piece of it and go, well, why am I doing this? And believe it or not, you know what really helped me? My ego. Because remember, I was doing drugs every day of my life at the time. And my ego one day got really infuriated. This was right when my soul had gotten a hold of me. And I was paying for other people's company with the things that I was buying. And I was like, wait a minute, and we're having intimate connections? Oh, hell no. And so I stopped doing it as a retaliatory response to everyone around me. And you know what I did with the time? I opened the Bible again. And I separated the church from my faith for myself in order to begin the process of then studying other spiritual things. I was not going to be boxed in and kept small anymore, and I was going to fight like hell to save my life. And it took years of struggle, and every time I thought I would get somewhere, the rug would get pulled from under me. I would end up, the assault happened, and then after that, the other assault happened with the thing on the back of my head, and all these things kept pulling the rug from under me. And each time my house would collapse again, and then I would have to start again, and then it would collapse again. Because what I was doing was I was avoiding the truth of what I could see glaring at me, which was, yes, I had released the pain of the violation as a child. But had I looked at the ramifications and how clearly they had affected my life, and it came down to that friendship bracelet thing. I had no friends, no real friends at this point. I was so alone, so lost. No one would help me. I was so far gone, y'all. It was bad. I was a death door. And it was a friendship bracelet that grabbed my attention. And what it was is I realized that because of that being the lure, I never trusted anybody. I never really let them in. I kept them at arm's length. And because of it, I realized I had full accountability for that moment. And the moment I began taking accountability for every unconscious choice I made that I allowed to become a conscious action in my life, I began to really get to the kernel of truth that what was happening. And at the end of the day, what I realized is that everything that I had done was ego. And everything I had done was to protect myself. And I blocked out the only thing that could save me, which was love. How could I ever expect to find anyone that I could trust or that I would love if I kept so many barriers up, blocking people from seeing me clearly? And you know what's interesting? The pandemic hit. And that was the worst part of my life. You see, the divine decided that if I was going to make it, that I was going to have to go the worst of distance. Not only had I just come out of the fucking wilderness, but now I was going into the desert. And so I became homeless during the pandemic, just to add flavor to the story. And I was left on my own, and if you guys remember that period, nobody was going anywhere, and I ended up in a shelter in Los Angeles. There was no food stamps, there was no nothing. And I would walk around the city of LA, not able to escape myself if I tried. It was just me nonstop all day. And if I complained, I had to work through the shadow. And finally got to the point where I had it with my shadow. And we had a big old blowout between, the complaining and me as the soul talking about, I knew that God was, I call him the divine. I knew that the divine was leading me to ultimate wholeness. And so I finally, because it permeated me, right? When you cannot escape the mirror of yourself and you are stuck in isolation, when you go into a cave like Jesus did, who again would prove to be a saving grace to me. When you go into the cave, you cannot escape the darkness that lays within. And it comes to a point where me and the darkness had some words. And I lashed out. I acted in like brash. I got drunk one night and it was just the worst type of retaliation from within myself, from the ego, fighting with my higher self, saying this stops now. And I was homeless, living in Skid Row at first, and then through a series of gauntlet of a maze that pretty much would have destroyed most people, I instead found peace in it because I could not escape myself. And so there was nothing but accountability waiting for me at every turn. And every teardrop that I shed became moisture and nutrients for the soil of who you see now. Every tear, God was there for me. The divine and the archangels were there for me. And I found my way back to a faith-based structure that worked for me, that did not weaponize God against me and did not make me feel like I had done anything wrong. And it took me forever to get there. But the psychology that was built around the suffering was that I somehow earned it and that no one in my life stuck around. And how could they? I never let anyone in, and I was not nice. And to this day, I'm super sweet and humble now, but if I see falseness in another person, I don't engage. I'm polite now, I wasn't then, but now I'm polite now, and I acknowledge their existence, and then I leave it alone. I don't bring them into my realm of consciousness, and I'll tell you why. Because the devil likes to play. And the devil loves to make you go back in time. And it makes you try to pull you back to who you were, even though that part of you is gone. And so the battle of trying to find my way home was trying to come back to my truth. The boy that existed, that before the violation, is the man you see now. The violated boy is no more. And neither are the echoes and shadows that came with it. And you would think releasing that would have been a rejoiceful moment, but for me it was heartbreaking. Because I had come to know them more than who I was. I had come to know the person that never trusted anybody, that kept everybody at arm's length, and that would be mad at them for not welcoming me more into their social groups. I was such a walking dichotomy with so much trauma, so much pain, so much illusion around me that I blamed everyone else until I couldn't escape myself. And I realized that there are victims and then there are students. And if many of you want to know why specifically I knew it was time to share at great depth, well, as much as I can do on me just talking to a camera, this is one of those conversations that would be much more interesting probably for most people if another person who either was in the struggle or had made it through the struggle and had picked up the pieces and can now explain it in great detail. That would be more engaging, but I'm doing the best I can with what I have. But I do understand that this is much better as a two-party conversation. But for the purposes of this, the journey to find your family, to find your soul tribe, to find the illuminaries like you who have gone through the fire, have let it engulf you and risen like the phoenixes, is a personal journey. And so the first step would be to be so open with you about how it affected every single decision I made throughout the rest of my life. And the only reason I bring up the other person is because I'm sure there's things that another person, if I engaged with them, would make me think of. But for the moment, just understand that a phoenix is born of fire, which means it has to have its life completely burned to the ground sometimes. Because if you are that lost, that everyone is at fault but you, then you will forever be the victim to circumstance and never be the circumstance itself that can heal other people. Long stood have we understood that hurt people hurt other people, but healed people heal other people. There's not a fire that you are going through that I have not somehow been affected by, of my own volition, mind you, now looking at it. And there's not a struggle that you can possibly say to me, well, how did you do it? that I can't explain to you in great detail how. Because in the end, it was my life's coursework. And I guess this is my dissertation to you about what it revealed about who I was meant to be. And how many years I lost by avoiding the shadow that had to engulf me. Because a phoenix born of fire raises from the ashes, from the darkness, from the leveling and burning of everything that no longer serves you. And isn't it befitting that it happens at the end of the year of the snake? A snake which sheds its skin as we go into the year of the fire horse. Not just the horse, but in the Chinese zodiac, the fire horse. And all of the different things and videos and music and things that are coming out that speak to the struggle of how you become the phoenix and helping people see clearly who you are by where you've been and the luggage you have dropped. What is it that Beyonce says? No passengers on my plane. So as you embark on this journey, for many of you who are stuck in mental health issue, understand that everyone on planet Earth has a cross to bear. It can be addiction of any kind, food, alcohol, sex. It can be trauma where you are misogynistic because of the way your father treated your mother. I mean, there's literally a multitude. Being orphaned is probably the worst thing that could ever have happened. Because remember, I didn't have a father figure. It was just me. I was the guy. And I had been victimized. So it would come to pass later in life that was purposeful. You see, my father is the divine, as is your father. And for those of you who feel orphaned, maybe you were being raised by something so much better than what you could have had in physical form. But until you begin the healing process of literally picking up the pieces and looking at them, and then observing the world around you and other people who are acting and behaving in similar ways, your compassion grows, coming from an origin source of the most compassionate energy in the world we call the divine. I did not get to know the divine for who the divine is, and not what people's interpretations of him were, or her, or it. I had to find it for myself. And it led me down an amazing journey that I would never change. Having said that, I will never excuse the behavior of what that person did to me. And to this day, I will fight on the fucking mountain to ensure that anyone who does that to anyone underage face the worst levels of hell. That I can promise you. But I also have compassion for the people who are not able yet to face the shadow it has caused their lives. You cannot escape yourself. And the costume you wear comes with a school workload. And there will come a day, if you embark on this journey, that it will level your life. And the new life built upon the ashes are that of the phoenix that rose against all odds. Everyone wrote me off. And yet I'm the one who can now share with you exactly how the trauma affected every single fabric point of my life. And as I now mend the broken pieces back together, the wholeness reveals the beauty of what it is to make it through the fire. And for those of you who are of faith, as I close this, because there's so much more to say, but I'm limited on time. You're in search of keys, and you're wondering why I chose now to be so candid. And it has to do with a particular artist who is a Christian artist who I recently wrote about. And he was talking about having lost his keys to the shadow. You get them back in physical form, at least for me. You see, the moment that I went into the desert and I spent 7 years of labor trying to figure it all out, more than 7 technically, because, I can be a slow learner if I don't agree with something. I will ask questions. When I went into the desert, I began having an odd thing happen that my friends to this day make fun of me. I found keys along all of my pathway. These are not mine. They've never been mine. And this, I've even written to, I found at the same time. But they're concrete. They cannot be taken by my shadow. And I have them for life. So though your shadow may pull the rug from under you, one day it will come to serve you. Because your shadow is the voice of you that is telling you where things are not in alignment. It serves you in the ability of pointing out, why are you being triggered? A trigger to me, as an Al statement, is an involuntary knee-jerk reaction to something someone does or a situation around you that is not consciously decided upon. Meaning, someone in a political environment says something to you, or says something that you don't agree with, and you immediately flash out at them, and then you think about it a minute later and go, why did I say that? That wasn't even worth it. You are having a trigger. And your shadow is the triggering party because it's showing you the coursework of where you lay right now, and it's asking you to unpack it so that you can regain your empowerment and your power back, to stand in front of that and go, you have no power here. The demiurge is real. The ego, man, the ego will destroy you. Narcissists is a perfect example of this. They're all across the world stage right now. Throwing man babies, throwing big old temper tantrums. Because the shadow will destroy itself as opposed to being wrong. And yet your soul will be the light that shines directly in its face. And when you do it often enough, you gain the keys. And the reason I'm bringing this up right now, before going into the journey itself in another video, probably with someone else, because it's hard sometimes to talk about yourself without feeling egoish. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because Nate, NF, had lost his keys. And you guys remember how I wrote a very interesting piece surrounding that. It's important for you to understand that it was NF who showed me what the hell these were. I had no idea, y'all. I had been wondering why I kept finding keys to the point where my friends, we were going to Mexico during the hurricane that happened here in LA. And on the way there, we were talking about it. And sure enough, we parked the car. We're about to cross the border because, we were going to go and have a nice time in Mexico. And as we get out of the car, we're at the carport, and we're about to get into I guess it was an Uber at the time. And as we're reaching the corner of the Uber, my friend, Mari, opens the door, and I look down, I go, oh, finally, and 2 keys at our footsteps. I picked them up, and I put them on my chain. And to this day, both of them can attest that happened in front of them. And it happens through my life. Every time I don't run from myself, it seems like I get something new in life. But I never thought in the world that I would actually physically find keys that would not make sense to me until one day I was watching a music video by a Christian artist, no less, who would help me understand that I had gotten home and I had the keys to my own castle. So as I close, the reason I share all this with you is that in hopes that you can look at your own life and see how trauma, whether childhood or other, splinters into the wheels of your destiny and can rob you of decades of friendships, of love, of close personal bonds, and of cooperation with people who are like-minded like you. Because a healed person, a whole person, can identify another whole person on sight. There is no question. And so for those of you who have kingdom spouses or divine unions, whatever your vernacular is for it, they're waiting for you, but you have to do the work required of you. You cannot heal what you cannot see, which means you cannot avoid looking at it. It's why therapy is so important. It's why spirituality is so important. It's why faith is so important. Because it is the combined pressure of the 3 that illuminates the shadow right in its eyes, and it dissipates immediately. And on that day, you gain your freedom to heal other people through your own journey. Have a great day.